Hello again, I'm Doug Monroe, Executive Director of Praxis Circle. Welcome back to Ann Bradley's class number 2, The Christian Economic Model, Human Flourishing. The feedback was Ann did a fantastic job with class 1. Like last time, a couple of comments before I pass the floor to Mason New, our Master of Educational Ceremonies. First, I want to thank our teammates, the Institute of Faith, Work, and Economics, for their assistance in putting this webinar together. A big thank you to Hugh Welshel, IFWE's founder and a tireless inspiration, and to his colleague, Jackie Isaacs, helping with social media. Jackie also wrote that terrific summary you received of Ann's first class. Work is vital to shalom and human flourishing. As Hugh has recently written, today, even work itself is under attack in the West. A reminder mentioned last time, human flourishing is not a prosperity gospel. It offers few foolproof benefits without hard, sustained, and godly work. Godly, there's that Imago Dei concept again. And yet Christianity has produced a model that's on track since World War II to eliminate poverty worldwide, as Ann showed last time in graphs. Nonetheless, Christ wants 100% of every Christian, including and especially one's work. As Paul says, we need to capture every thought for Christ. That's what truth does. And the truth or reality is that economics is one part of our total calling in life, with work being vital to following Christ's teachings. As a result, my second point is we need to understand the life-saving guarantees as Christians we do receive to get the most from individual and group flourishing. I am not a minister, but know that to give the Trinity 100%, we need to have faith in Christ and understand all areas of life from his perspective, not only economics. Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Christians worldwide agree that's the only way to maximize happiness and flourishing and find salvation. This explains why Praxis Circle wants to bring it all together with complementary Christian worldview classes in 2023, with guidance from our 40 Praxis Circle contributors, including Ann Bradley. I'm sure Ann will touch on some of this today. Thanks to all of you for giving us your valuable time. Mr. New, the talking stick is yours to introduce Ann to those who missed our first session.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Ann, of course. Hello again to all of our friends who attended our last webinar. And if you are joining us for the very first time today, I welcome you to the second of a two-part webinar series entitled The Christian Economic Model with Dr. Ann R. Bradley. Today's event is brought to you by Praxis Circle with our co-sponsor, the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, also known as IFWE. My name is Mason New, and I serve as the Education Director for Praxis Circle in order to bring you the best learning programs designed to help you build your worldview. Today, we will hear from Dr. Ann Bradley, the George and Sally Mayer Fellow for Economic Education and Academic Director at the Fund for American Studies in Washington, D.C. She is also a professor of economics at the Institute for World Politics and a senior affiliate at the Acton Institute. She is a former VP at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. Dr. Bradley earned a PhD and master's degree in economics from George Mason University and a bachelor's degree in economics from James Madison University. In the previous webinar 2 weeks ago, Dr. Bradley discussed Genesis, creation, and Imago Dei, in order to explain how biblical truths relate to economics and human flourishing, as well as the economic realities and the purpose of self-interest as it relates to God and his creation. Today, Dr. Bradley will examine the application of economic policy as it relates to human flourishing in civil society, while also discussing the results of economic systems built from Christian and non-Christian perspectives. Dr. Bradley will speak for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and then there will be some time to ask questions. We have a large group of participants from all over the world, so please write your questions using the Q&A button found on your Zoom interface. I'll try to ask as many of your questions to Dr. Bradley as I can, and then we will end about 1:15. Finally, I'd like to mention one more important detail. At the end of Dr. Bradley's talk, we'll put a link to the survey in the chat, just a few questions in order to help us improve and enhance your learning experience. We will also email you this survey. For everyone who takes the survey and provides a mailing address on the form, we will send you a free copy of Counting the Cost, Christian Perspectives on Capitalism, a book that Dr. Bradley co-edited. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Ann Bradley. Thank you.
Thank you, Mason, and thanks everybody for being here today. I am really excited for part two of our discussion, and of course, we'll make sure that I leave plenty of time for questions, and looking forward to hearing those. I want to say something before I get started. We're going to do a quick recap, but the thing I want to tell you is this. Yesterday, it was announced by the World Bank and other organizations that the world reached a population of 8 billion people. And there are many across the world that view this with malaise, with worry, with concern that this is a problem, that too many people is bad for the planet. And of course, this is all about the right institutions. But I want to say that this is cause for celebration and rejoicing because people are good for the planet. What they need is economic freedom. And that's what we're going to talk about today broadly, and how, in my view, that's an extension of a proper understanding of economics and a proper understanding of our anthropology. So just quickly for those, it's been a little bit of time since we talked about this, and maybe some of you weren't here for the first session. So I just want to kind of build that foundation really quickly. It is very clear if you look at the meta narrative of Scripture that we were created to create. And we get this from Genesis 1. We get it again in Genesis 2, where we're told to work the garden and care for it. And the purpose of our work is to, of course, the purpose of everything, of course, is to bring glory to God. And so he designed the world in a very specific way. At the end of the 7 days of creation, he calls his creation very good because it is complete, yet it is not finished. We play an active role in extending our creativity and applying our human creativity to God's designed order. And in that he is glorified. And in that we both experience human flourishing and contribute to human flourishing. So human flourishing, kind of has those mutual purposes attached to it, which is that we get to produce it and we get to consume it. That is God's desire. Sin obviously mars this process, but the task remains. So we get this throughout Genesis and throughout the Old Testament as well. Genesis 3, we talk about the consequences of sin. So the work of our hands is now frustrating. It's described as hard, difficult toil, but God doesn't undo the cultural mandate or the creation mandate, which he gives us, he commands us in the first part of Genesis. And so sin mars the process and it creates brokenness. And the brokenness really starts in terms of our relationships with ourselves, with God, with each other, and with the earth. So our work becomes frustrating, it's unfulfilling, it's error prone, and it is not always going to be done for the glory of God because our sin gets in the way. We want to glorify ourselves. So we see this is reiterated in Genesis 9 after the flood, right? As soon as Noah and his family get off the ark, they are told what? To be fruitful and multiply. So it's a reiteration of what God always wanted us to do, right? The promise that he will never destroy the earth is there, but we know and we're given more insight, and this is an extension or a continuation. And then I talked a little bit about Jeremiah. In Jeremiah, in this letter to people who are exiled, I think this is really important for our understanding of a biblical conception of human flourishing. So we're not talking about a secular conception of human flourishing, which I think today really confuses, kind of how people think about this, right? Because a secular conception of human flourishing would say, to figure out what your truth is, that there's not the truth, but there's your truth, and kind of you can do whatever you want and be whoever you want to be, change your identity, even all of those things are fungible in this kind of new world. And so kind of that's not what we're talking about. We're certainly talking about an understanding, a scriptural understanding of human flourishing. And so Jeremiah helps us understand this really important point, which gets to my call for economic freedom as a Christian. And it's this idea that human flourishing, or the word prosperity that's used, Doug mentioned, we're not advocating a prosperity gospel here. And I think that's really important. We're not saying, you do all the right things and you're going to be blessed with the mansion and all these types of things. That's not what the promise is. And so Jeremiah helps us understand that even people in the situation of exile are called to do what they were always supposed to do: build families, build cities, build communities, be active, even though they feel maybe not connected, right? Because they're exiles. And so that's really important. And it also says that we are to seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. For if it prospers, you prosper. So biblical prosperity is mutual. Adam Smith, who's now known as the father of modern economics, I mentioned him last time, he understood this. So he kind of says in The Wealth of Nations at one point, the city cannot flourish if a vast number of its occupants or population are starving and miserable. So it is a kind of, he brings this theological truth into kind of an economic conception of how we think about building up the city and seeking wealth creation. So again, Adam Smith, as a moral philosopher, kind of really, I think, is important in economics because he brings some of these truths, whether he knowingly brings them for scripture or not. The reason that they are right is because they are found in scripture. And so then we talked about anthropological truths. This is also very important, right? We are who we are because we are who God created us to be. These things are not negotiable. You can like them or not like them, but they just are realities. And so any economic system or political system has to reconcile itself with both the anthropological truths of the word as given and revealed to us by God, as well as the economic truths of the world. And if we ignore those to try to change them or pretend they don't exist, then our economic systems, our laws, our culture, our politics, they are not going to get us on that path to human flourishing. So, there's a right way to human flourishing, and there are ways that will lead you, directly in the opposite direction from human flourishing. So what are those anthropological truths that we talked about? People have dignity. Why do we have dignity? Mason mentioned this term. We are imago Dei. We are actively bearing the image and likeness of God. And so we have dignity because of our creation. We also have reason. So we can discern things. We can't do that perfectly. And our sin, of course, messes this up, right? It makes it difficult. We have free will, we have choice. So people are not robots. They actually respond to realities as they perceive them. And we're social beings, in much in the same way that the Trinity is a model for sociality. Human beings are highly social. We are interdependent. We need each other. So we can't flourish alone because that's not God's design. He designed us to be in community, in relationship with each other. We can think about this in very obvious ways in the way that our families interact with one another. But economics allows us to think about a way that we can bring more people into the community so we can have this interdependence beyond our families, beyond our churches, beyond our neighborhoods. Then there's kind of these set of economic truths. These are just a few, but I think they're at the core. And one is really, kind of jumping to the middle of my list here, scarcity. Scarcity is true whether you like it, whether you don't like it. And it's a really kind of an interesting thing to think about scarcity in a time of what economists are calling superabundance. So we live in a time of superabundance where things are becoming cheaper. And this is overall, right, over that global mapping of human history. We have much lower opportunity costs. We have much more abundance. And like I said, we have much more people. We've crossed the 8 billion mark. People are self-interested. This does not mean they're always greedy. Scripture and economics, I think proper economics makes a distinction between greed and self-interest. Self-interest is how we make choices. It's the mechanism by which we decide to do something or refrain from doing something. And what are the things that motivate those? Incentives, right? So people respond to incentives. And that's a deeply subjective process unique to each individual. I just want to I mentioned this last time too. These ideas are reiterated in the New Testament as well. So we want to look at the meta narrative, the broad story of Scripture and its commandments, because we understand that it's the Word of God, it's inerrant, and it provides important lessons for how we live today. So, it's important when you're looking to Scripture to kind of inform whether it's you're thinking on policy or law or culture or what we should do, what we shouldn't do. We look at the meta narrative rather than kind of cherry picking Scripture to fit our priors, which of course is just part of human nature. But I think we need to be actively trying not to do that, because it leads us to improper interpretations of Scripture. And so, when you think about what we learn, as particularly here in Matthew, right? Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. So we know that all of our lives are to be lived loving the Lord our God with all of our being. And the second is like it. And I have this highlighted: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two things. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. How do we do this? So these don't sound like economic questions, but I'm going to try to bridge these theological commandments and these theological realities about our anthropology and the nature of our humanness to talk about political economy, right? What type of institutions do we need so that we can do these things? That is the question. So economics and kind of all those types of institution or rules of the game need to hinge on this. Are they allowing us to do this as best as sinners can, right? We can't get perfect. So we're not striving for kind of some utopian society. We can't get that. And so there's this word in economics that starts being used in the early part of the 20th century called catalactics or catalaxy, which I have here. It's an important term. It's this notion in the Greek. It means to bring into the community. It also means, another translation of it is to make a friend from an enemy. So I want us to kind of think about that word catalaxy, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Bring people into the community. Turn enemies into friends. How do we do that? And what type of, kind of societies and social systems allow us to do that? So it's all about the institutions, right? We need the right environment for creativity. We need to empower human beings to unleash that creativity onto the planet, right? And that's why I can say with great confidence that crossing the 8 billion population mark, global population mark, is something to be celebrated. Why? Because we're told to be fruitful and multiply. And really the reason here is because people are the source, the only source of human creativity. There's no other source of human creativity. And so people are good for the planet, but what do they need? They need the right incentives. They need the right rules. And that's what economists mean when we use the word institutions. We mean the rules of the game. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the application of these truths that we've been building up towards over the past, kind of last week and this week, and think about kind of what system best allows that. And so a couple of things we need to keep in mind is this: we're always dealing with fallen, finite human beings. We can't flourish alone, which means one person, one organization can't solve the problems of the world. God designed us to work together. So we need to think about an economic system that incentivizes or induces peaceful cooperation, not violent cooperation, but peaceful cooperation, right? And so it has to recognize these anthropological and economic realities. And because we live in a world of scarcity, here's the thing: we always have to ration. We have to figure out who's going to get what. And this, of course, can be very violent. And so if you look at the whole story of human history, it's been a story of violence. It's been a story of oppression, exploitation, what we call in economics zero-sum games, right? So if you're at the top, if you have the force, then you can kind of take the goodies and kind of blockade or keep people from tapping in or getting things that you have. But we want to transform from zero-sum games, which are kind of winner-loser games, to positive sum games, which are winner-winner games. But like I said, it's really important to understand we're never going to get perfect. We're never going to get an economic system that gets, things perfect, the perfect allocation of scarce resources, or all the goods and services that are good and honorable and virtuous. We're not going to get that because we're dealing with sinners. So economists are always asking this question: what are the alternatives, right? And so I want to put one forth to us today that I think works because it really taps into the truths we've talked about, and that is economic freedom. And so this is an empirical exercise in trying to, and we do this, we measure countries across the world. So it's a macroeconomic indicator. And the economist who really kind of spearheaded this was Milton Friedman. You may have heard his name before or heard of him. He was a Nobel Prize winning economist in the 1970s. He said, look, we talk about this word prosperity all the time. We use that term. What do we mean? What does that mean? I can imagine in my head what it looks like, but let's actually get granular and try to measure it. So in the 1970s, Milton Friedman partnered with the Fraser Institute, which is a Canadian-based think tank, and they came up with what I'm about to share with you, which is called the Economic Freedom of the World Report. And you can Google that, and it's available online at no monetary cost, just your time and looking through it. And it's published every year. Now in the 70s, we just had a harder time getting data, so it was only published every 5 years. But you should be able to take a country and trace it back into the early 70s and look at the changes over time. And so economic freedom, how do we describe it? And then I'm going to tell you how we measure it. How we describe it is a society where people are free to enter and exit markets at their determination, right? So I get to choose where I'm going to shop. I get to choose what I'm going to buy. People can't force me to buy things. They can't force me to refrain from buying things. I can shop at the businesses I want to, right? So that's one of the things we look at. We look at freedom to enter and exit markets. We look at freedom to being free to use your property rights as you see fit, right? You don't have to ask permission. So sometimes we call this permissionless innovation. This is a society where property rights are protected, which means we have to have the rule of law. It means that there's some role for government, right? So economic freedom acknowledges that the government has a role in protecting this environment, right? So if I'm free from the force and fraud of others, and that's another role that government plays kind of when we think about economic freedom. So again, we're talking about political economy. We're not just talking about markets, but we're talking about how markets interact with law and with government. And so, that's kind of generally what we're talking about if we were describing a place that has lots of economic freedom. So how do we measure it? There's kind of 5 areas of economic freedom. I'm going to briefly go over them. Yeah.
Can I interrupt for 1 second? Can you share your slides? Since people are asking for that.
Well, they're not shared.
Yeah.
Not sure.
Sorry to interrupt, but
Do you see the slides?
yeah, I can see it now. Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. Okay, is that good?
Looks great. Thank you.
Okay, great, sure. So there's 5 pillars of economic freedom, and I want to briefly kind of tell you what they are. And then we, as economists, when we measure this, we empirically give a number and give a score. So each country has a score. We also do this in the United States. So you can get data for the economic freedom score for each state. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So the first thing we measure is sound money. And this is going to have to do with the policies of the central bank. And so, are they kind of conservative, small c, right? Kind of very cautious about inflation and printing money and things like this. So the reason that that's really important is because, if you live in a society with lots of volatile inflation, then entrepreneurs can't do what they do. They can't make investments. They're discouraged from giving investments into the future. The other thing we measure is freedom to trade internationally. So, imagine opening a business and you were only allowed to sell to the people that lived on your street. You wouldn't have a lot of customers, right? And you wouldn't be able to serve as many people. And so if you could extend that to your neighborhood and then your zip code and then your state. So that's what we're looking at here is, does the society have free trade arrangements, mostly with the rest of the world, which again allows for this kind of global cooperation. The other thing we look at is the regulatory burden. So the regulatory burden would describe a couple of things. How easy is it to get a loan? How easy is it to open a business? Do you have to bribe people? Do you have to know someone? Do you have to have connections? Do you have to, kind of go through lots of educational kind of requirements or licensing requirements? And the higher the regulatory burden, the more difficult it is for, again, small businesses, which is how most businesses start, right? For them to get going. And so it's really important for economic mobility. The other thing we look at is property rights. And so again, I talked about this briefly, that the protection that the government affords to individuals to protect their property. This is essential because if we protect people's property, what are we doing? We're giving them an incentive to make investments into the future. And that's how you get economic growth. Economic growth requires that people are not just thinking about today, but thinking about the future innovation, future consumption, future problems, right? Entrepreneurs are problem solvers. And of course, that's not a perfect process either, but that's the role that they play in a market economy. And then number 5 is the size of government relative to the size of the economy. This is not an ideological point, it's an economic point. And let me explain what I mean by that. The size of the government is important because the government can only get its resources in a few ways. It can tax people, it can borrow, and it can use inflation to get revenue. And so if the government is too big, right, what it's going to do is crowd out the other spheres of society. It's going to crowd out civil society. It's going to crowd out the market because it is taking from those other sectors to be able to engage in, making roads and space programs and funding the military, all the things. And many of the things that government does are legitimate things that we need it to do, but it has to be small relative to the size of the market economy. And so when we look at some countries, Venezuela would be an example of, kind of an economy that really has declined tragically over the past 4 decades. And the reason for that is because the government got too big and it kind of swallowed up those other sectors. So now they can't perform. And the data is scaled on a score from 0 to 10. So a score of 0 would be you have no economic freedom. A score of 10 would be you have perfect economic freedom. No country has a 10. No country really has a 0, although there are some countries that we just can't even give them a score. North Korea is an example. We just don't have reliable data. And so again, this is very helpful because we look at this year by year and we can tell and get a big picture story of what's going on and what's allowing people to kind of thrive or what's holding them back from thriving. It's also very informative from a policy perspective and from a legal perspective, because it can help us understand what changes might need to be made so that we can get improvements. And again, why do we care about kind of economic freedom? Economic freedom is a means to a bigger end. It's the means to the end of allowing people to use their talents, to use their skills in very productive social ways, right? Not just kind of getting my income for myself. It's about kind of serving other people through the use of your gifts. And so if you look at this color-coded map, this is a map of kind of the most up-to-date map of economic freedom. The index just came out in October. It comes out in the fall of every year. And if you look at the countries that are in the blue, those are the countries that are the most free. If you look at the countries that are in the red, those are the countries that are the least free. So they score at the bottom of the index. And this kind of green, the second quartile means mostly free. Third quartile means mostly unfree. I think this kind of helps us understand a lot of things. First of all, I'd like to point out that it's not a coincidence at all that the countries that are in the blue that have lots of economic freedom, they tend to have lots of civil rights. They tend to be mostly kind of democratic or have democracy-like institutions. They have longer lives. They have kind of all these things, right? And the economies that are in the red, the least free, or even the orange are economies that are struggling to get off ground zero. And so the other thing that economic freedom teaches us is that there's no economic destiny. I think that's a really important point, that a country can go from rich to poor, which is a tragedy, but a country can go from poor to rich, which is something we celebrate, right? And again, the reason economists care about income growth, not just, is not for material only purposes. It's that income gives you choices and it alleviates your time in very fundamental ways. So one of the things that we can do lots of regressions and econometric work here to kind of try to understand what this means. Like, in other words, why should you care about this? And one here is looking at GDP per capita. GDP per capita, again, is a proxy for income. And when you score that along economic freedom, what you see is that economic freedom is very nicely correlated with income growth. So if you are born in a country that has a lot of economic freedom, your average income is going to be a lot higher, and your chances for income mobility, meaning you might start out poor, but you don't have to stay there, right? Whereas if you're in one of these countries in the red, some of the problems in those countries is that you don't have an escape in terms of an income. You can't have, there's no opportunities really to grow your income. As I mentioned, I just want to put this up here. We have lots of good data in the United States. So these folks that measure economic freedom have also started measuring economic freedom of the 50 states. And so you can see what states perform really well. You can see what states are the least free. It's also really interesting to look at migration patterns. People tend to leave states that have not very much economic freedom, and they head towards states that have a lot more economic freedom, which is why people might leave California, for example, and go to Texas, right? Because Texas is a much more robust opportunity environment. So let's look at some of the outcomes, because I think that's why we care about this. I have a few graphs. This is a more graph heavy presentation. And then I'm going to end on some kind of anecdotes and stories that kind of support this. So economic freedom and income, this is just another way to present the data that I was just showing you. This is very powerful. So if you are born today in a country that's the least free, your average income is about $5,800 per person per year. If you're born in one of the blue countries that's the most free, it's about $44,000 per person per year. And so again, this helps us understand migration patterns, right? Because if you wake up in Cuba, your average income is going to be far lower than if you wake up in Canada, right? And so the institutional environment matters very much about in terms of what people are able to do. And so that's, I think, why we have kind of, there's a moral component to arguing for advancing economic freedom, because it affects people's lives and their livelihood. Economic freedom and economic growth. People, if you asked, kind of did a survey of people on the street and asked them, would they like to live in a country that has economic growth or economic decline or is economically stagnant? Most people will tell you they want to live in a society with economic growth. Why? Because it just means growing opportunities, more jobs, more kind of, income, lots of things that we associate with living in a kind of dynamic type of society. And so again, in the least free, economic growth is much lower than in the most free. In the most free countries, you're going to have much more growth, higher growth, more stable growth, and that provides predictability for people, and again, gives them more opportunities. This is from the Heritage Foundation. They also do an economic freedom index every year. So that's really useful to have a lot of different organizations that are doing this data collection. It just makes the data better over time. But what we see here is, again, they use different kind of language, but if you live in the repressed countries, your average years of going to school as a child are 5.5 years. In the most free, and this is total, right? So this is at the age of 25. And if you're in the most free, it's almost 12 years. So you can complete high school much easier in a society with lots of economic freedom. And if you're in a repressed economy, you can't. And there's many reasons for this. But the most pressing reason for having to drop out of school is because you have to help with household production, right? So if you have to wash the clothes by hand, and if you have to go collect water, and if you're living in agricultural subsistence, which almost, the entire world lived that way 250 years ago, there's no time to take off and go to school. I think about my own children. They haven't had, they're just little still, 12 and 9. But they don't have paying jobs, and that's a luxury, right? They get to go to school every day because their time is free. They're not producing for our household, so that we can eat every day. Economic freedom and immortality, again, thinking to be fruitful and multiply, and thinking of last time we talked about Jonathan Pennington's conception of shalom, right? One of the characteristics of shalom for Pennington, which I think is important from a biblical perspective, is that people have fertility, longevity, right? So you live a long time, you're strong, you can raise up communities and raise up children. We can't do that if we have very high infant mortality rates. And of course, again, if you look at the long scope of human history, this was the norm. Everybody died at much higher rates giving birth. So this used to be the norm, but now it's not, right? So again, look here, most free societies, very low infant mortality rates compared to the least free societies, very high infant mortality rates. And a lot of this is due to kind of healthcare problems in other countries and those types of infrastructure due to a lack of markets. So the way I want us to think about this is just not some countries have figured this out and they're rich, and some countries are poor and they can't figure it out. I think that's the wrong way to understand this. And so I like what Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on microfinance, he calls us all bonsai people. And particularly when he thinks about poor people in the world, he's from Bangladesh. He talks about poor people as today's bonsai people. And so this is the analogy that he gives. He says, if you take a seed of a bonsai tree and you plant it in a little pot, what you're going to get is this little small stunted tree, right? You put it on your coffee table, it looks really nice, but it's not going to grow. But if you take the same seed and you put it in its natural habitat outside, it's going to look like this. What's the difference? It's not the seed, it's the environment, right? And so that's what economic freedom helps us understand. Economic freedom helps us cultivate an environment that allows for greater human flourishing, right? So people who live in desperately poor countries, it's not because they don't know how to be rich or they don't want to be rich or they're not, able to have democracy. A lot of those explanations have been offered in the literature and they fall short. What it's really about is the institutional environment. And so economic freedom gives us a roadmap for that institutional infrastructure that then we can come in with policy recommendations and things like this to try to figure out what to do. Just a reminder, this is, I showed you this last time, it's one of my favorites, but this is kind of looking at global GDP over time. I just put this out as a reminder because I think we should be overwhelmed, overjoyed, and just kind of minds blown by this graph. Because again, the reality is for most of human history, if you look at this orange graph, right, we have lived in immiserating poverty and we've lived short lives. So that is not what God desires. If you go back to the language of Genesis, right, the language of Genesis is not about early death, starvation, disease, right? It's not about that. That's not God's intention. But it took us a long time in human history, right, to even kind of, it's really after 1900 that we cross this massive economic growth, where kind of ordinary people have a chance. They have income mobility, right? And so we want to study this. We want to understand it. And I kind of tie it directly to the opening up of human creativity, again, permissionless innovation, right? The destruction of hierarchies that held people down kind of in perpetuity before that. And again, there are fellow human beings across the world that still live in those perpetuated hierarchies that are not their doing. And so we need to think about extending economic freedom. I want to focus on the US a little bit. That's just the country that I know the most about because that's where I'm from. And so, I think some aspect of thinking about economic freedom, thinking about what the right set of policies are for human flourishing really requires that we get in there and look at the data, because there's a lot of myths, perpetuated myths about the world. One perpetuated myth I just talked about, right? People think that 8 billion people is bad, not good. That's a myth. Another myth that you hear is that global poverty is increasing, not decreasing. That's a myth, as evidenced by this graph I just showed you. Another myth in the United States is just that the middle class is shrinking. That's actually not a myth, it's true. But look at this graph here, we'll kind of review it very briefly. The middle class, which is this light and kind of this medium blue color here, and these numbers are established by the Census Bureau, not me or anybody else. So the Census Bureau decides what qualifies as low income, which is below 35,000. And they decide what classifies as middle income, 35 to 100, and then high income individuals, 100,000 or more. So that's not kind of made up numbers, that's the Census Bureau. And so look at what we see here. In the late 1960s, 37% of the American population were low income. Today, that's 27.9%. So this is very easy to acquire data as well. So this is not kind of difficult or obscure data to find, but I think there's a perpetual myth that the middle class is shrinking because people are going into poverty. But what this graph is showing us is the middle class is shrinking because people are getting richer. So look at this top dark blue. Again, in the late 1960s, 9% were high income individuals. And today it's 30.4%. And again, this is adjusted for 2018 dollars. So we're trying to adjust for inflation and all those types of things, right? And so, what's going on that would lead us to have this kind of middle class getting richer, and people in low income groups are escaping those groups. So this is called income mobility. It's a symptom of economic freedom, right? Because people are allowed to give it a go. They're allowed to experiment. They're allowed to test, kind of through the entrepreneurial process, how to serve their fellow human beings. And in the market economy, you're only rewarded, right, by service that's well done. So what's the bad news? And this is global and domestic to the United States. The bad news is that economic freedom took a big hit this year. This is from the most recent report. Our average global score was a 7 out of 10. It's now a 6.83. And economic freedom is lagged. So the 2022 index is measuring 2020 data. And the economists that assemble this index are suggesting that the reason that the score has dropped so much, which is, as you can see from this trend, is not traditional for that to happen. So this is very unusual, is because of COVID. And more importantly, government responses to COVID, because government responses to COVID include extensive lockdowns. China, for example, is still engaged in this zero COVID policy, which is pretty much impossible to obtain. Shutting down schools, shutting down businesses, this shuts down economic growth, right? The United States, by the way, in the third quarter of 2020 had its biggest drop in GDP since we've been recording GDP. So it was worse than the Great Depression. So the reason that we care about this, right, this is because all the good things that come along with economic freedom then take a hit. Now, here's the thing. If you live in a very wealthy country, you might be able to, not even feel fazed by this. Some people do, of course. But if you are living in the bottom of the global income distribution, then that type of regression in economic freedom is devastating. So the economists, again, who measure this are suggesting that this wipes out about 10 years of progress. Well, what things do we lose when we lose economic freedom? All these types of things that are correlated with economic freedom that we talked about, right? Civil liberties, political liberties, high levels of education, really good environmental performance, health and longevity. Those are the outcomes of economic freedom, right? Those are correlated with very high levels of economic freedom. So when economic freedom takes a hit, we lose. And when we lose, right, who gets hurt the worst? Christians have a very clear call in scripture to care for the poor. I've never been in a group of people where I say, Christians are called to care for the poor, and I get disagreement. What people tend to disagree about is the means by which you do that, of course. So I want to give a few examples, again, of kind of where I think that, especially example in the United States, we're kind of losing on some of these margins. This is an example that's really getting a lot of attention now. It's called occupational licensing, and it would fall under that regulatory burden of economic freedom. What we're finding is that more jobs today than ever require a license before you can do the job. Sometimes that's a good idea. For example, if you have to have heart surgery, you really want to make sure that your doctor went to medical school, is up on their training, knows, all the proper procedures, right? So you can make arguments that there's some amount of regulation that is productive. This example that I'm going to give you is a very hard case to make that it's productive. So what we're seeing is that hair braiders are increasingly required across the United States to be licensed. And this little chart is showing you across a few states, which is what you see, those abbreviations on the bottom. Look at a state like Florida, which, by the way, does really well in economic freedom. Florida only has 16 hours required to be a hair braider. And they have 6,000, almost 6,100 hair braiders. But look at right next to it, Louisiana, 500 hours of licensing work required, or educational work required to get your license. There's only 47 hair braiders. And the reason that we can understand that these regulations come to be in the first place is through kind of lots of what we call cronyism, right? Which is where corporations will go to the state, kind of state courthouses, and they'll ask for privileges. And that's really the story behind hair braiding licensing requirements. It's mostly salons that are already in business, and they don't want to compete with a woman who's braiding hair at her kitchen table, running an in-home business. And so what they're doing is they're using the state to protect them from some competition. But in doing so, what are they doing? They're cutting off the bottom of the ladder of income mobility for this woman, right? Because this is a low capital enterprise. You don't need to have a building, right? You don't need to have a college degree. You need very few supplies. The most important thing in hair braiding is the skill, right? The skill. And so we're protecting some and through privilege, and we're hurting others. This is a winner-loser type of game. We want to avoid those types of games, right? So I want to show you something else. I have a lot of graphs today, and I'm happy to refer back to them in the Q&A. But this is very eye-opening. I follow Mark Perry. He's an economist at AEI. This is on the bottom. You can see the title of his blog. It's called Carpe Diem, and he loves graphs. So he's very helpful to me because he creates them, and then I can think about them. But this is a graph that's really important because what it's showing you is the lines, the red lines are goods and services that have gotten more expensive over the last 20 years. The blue lines are goods and services that have gotten cheaper over the last 20 years. And remember, this is when we talked about kind of occupational licensing as part of that regulatory burden pillar of economic freedom. It's very clear why when you start to think about that. TVs, computer software, toys, this is where lots of competition, lots of, kind of international trade brings these things to us, and international competition, it makes them cheaper, right? And they're not overly regulated or high regulated industries compared to, look at the top, hospital services, college, medical care, childcare, right? And wages are barely higher than inflation. And so these things hurt people. Again, if you're at the bottom of the income distribution, this hurts you the most, right? Because if you're very wealthy, you can absorb, kind of inflation easier than someone who has very low level of income. So it's great that TVs are cheap and affordable, right? We think that's a good thing, but you can't eat TVs for breakfast, right? But food and beverages here are outpacing inflation. But what if you're sick? All of us are going to get sick at some point. You want the most cutting edge medical care available to you, and you don't want to have to be in the top 1% to afford it. These in the red are the most regulated elements of the American economy. And you could do this analysis for other countries and you could find similar results. So what economic freedom is doing is it's unleashing human creativity, and it's doing what my friend calls progressive cheapening. It's making goods and services formerly available to only kind of very wealthy people available to all of us. And so I told you I'd end with a story. I have more slides than I can always know what to do with usually, but I want to give a story. So I've given you a lot of data about how economic freedom is incredibly valuable. And I think the reason that it is because it provides an environment where people can unleash their creativity in the most productive ways, right? The market economy needs an ethos underneath it. It needs virtue. So the market economy can't accomplish all things, but it's very important here. And so kind of I can give you all the statistics in the world, but I want to tell you a story. So this is a patent that was filed by this man. You've probably never heard of him. He never made the cover of Time magazine, as far as I can tell, but an amazing entrepreneur. And Henry Turkle was a doctor in the 1950s who worked with Down syndrome babies. Down syndrome babies have problems in that they can't eat on their own because they have sucking reflex problems. And so as a doctor who worked with Down syndrome babies, what Henry Turkle did was he filed this patent in 1950, and it was awarded in 1952. And this is called an infant nasal feeding tube. So this is a tube. It's a very small piece of plastic. It's taped to the infant's face, you can see in the picture, and it delivers milk right into the stomach. And that solves the problem. Okay, this is a life-saving, food-giving innovation. How did he know it was needed? Because he was a specialist who worked with babies who couldn't eat. That's what we talk about, what we mean when we mean permissionless innovation and entrepreneurship. Okay, so that's that story. I want to tell you how it affected my life. This is my daughter. Her name is Bailey. She's named after my father. And this is Bailey when she was born. So when Bailey was born, it's a very long story, which I'll spare you most of the details, but she was almost 9 weeks early. And so she lived in this kind of incubator for a while. And preemies can't do a lot of things that they need to do to survive, including regulate their heart rate. They can't regulate their body temperature, and they can't eat on their own. And so all these things that are surrounding her are doing those things for us. She has monitors on her, and she's kind of swaddled in this thing that's providing her heat. And if you look at her face, you can see that infant nasal feeding tube developed by Henry Turkle in 1950 is taped to her face. And I had a lot of time, because I was in the hospital a long time with her, to think about this process. And so that's actually how I discovered who Henry Turkle was. But you know what's amazing about this story is that Henry Turkle's invention in 1950 was not used on preemies. And the reason is because preemies didn't survive in 1950. But in 2013, when my daughter was born, this was used on her, and it was life-saving, right? Life-saving. So it's economic freedom that gave my family those opportunities, right? And I had to think a lot about myself compared to someone like, if you're waking up in, Venezuela today, you don't have doctors and specialists and medical students and all these people running around to help you like I did. So I started thinking about, when I was in the hospital, what is so different about me? I don't deserve this more. Everybody deserves this. So what's the difference? And the difference is economic freedom, right? I live in a society with lots of economic freedom. So I have these innovations available to me, and they literally gave life, right? Extended my daughter's life. And if you wake up in Venezuela in premature labor like I did, right, you don't have that same opportunity. And so economic freedom saves lives. It doesn't just give us TVs and video games. It gives us infant nasal feeding tubes, right? Through the work of the hands of millions of strangers that really don't even know that they're cooperating. The last thing I'll say about the story is, when we were going through this, we thought a lot about the doctors, right? Because they have so much specialized knowledge on these little tiny infants and their bodies. And I thought, gosh, we're so blessed to have the knowledge of the doctors. And the more I thought about it, I thought, well, there's a janitor that works at the hospital, and the janitor takes those infant nasal feeding tubes off the FedEx truck and puts it away. And the FedEx driver is just as important for saving my daughter's life as the janitor is, as the receptionist at the hospital, as the specialized doctor, right? You need all of those people to where God has called them at that time to cooperate to give us this. And so I think this is the moral of the story. It's not just growing incomes. It's what growing incomes give us. So Mason, I'm going to stop there and hand it to you and let you tell us what to do next.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you for sharing that story. It really puts into context so much of what you're talking about, economic freedom being, life-saving, and thank you for sharing that personal story, because I think that's really how we can understand what this economic freedom really means. We've got a pretty extensive list of questions here, but I'd like to go back to the beginning of your talk, where you talked about freedom to choose, but also sin being part of the human existence and what it does and creates brokenness. And here's one question from one of our participants. How should Christians think about calls for the legalization of trade in illicit drugs? Does it come down to the question whether the state has an obligation to protect individuals against themselves? And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is such a great question, so important. And I will be brief, Mason, because I could talk about this a lot. I think that this is why I said, markets are just full of sinners, as is any institution. So you're going to get this stuff, right? You're going to get trade in illicit drugs, and you're going to get people that demand things that are not good for them. And so one response, of course, which is the response we've taken in the United States, other countries have done the same, is to kind of declare those things illegal. And if you look at the literature on this and kind of the assessment of how that's going, it's not going very well. And so I am reluctant to kind of just have outright bans on these things. And the reason why is the same reason that you get it. So when we ask government to ban something that we don't like, which could legitimately be, there could be legitimate arguments for saying people shouldn't do that for illicit drugs, for example, right? There's legitimate reasons to not do drugs, for example. But the problem is the government doesn't have the same set of incentives as people do in the marketplace. And so this tends to not go like we want it to. And it creates what economists call and are very wary of is unintended consequences. So, we've engaged in the war on drugs in the United States, that's what we call it, right? Since Nixon was in the White House. So it's a long time. We have a lot of data on it. And kind of what we see are that there's a lot of what we call illicit markets, right? So they're still being bought and sold. So what an economist would say to that is, okay, well, what you're doing isn't working then, right? So still being bought and sold, they're much more potent than they used to be. There's a lot more violence associated with drugs than there would otherwise be, right? Because you can't kind of buy them legitimately. So what I want to be careful to say is this doesn't mean you should do nothing, right? People tend to think it's like, well, the government should do it or we just kind of like sell it in CVS. There's probably a middle ground there where we can, again, think about the regulatory regime, which is subject to incentive problems as well. But is there a different way to kind of deal with this problem such that it doesn't create other bigger problems, right? So now you have people making meth from, whatever they're making it from that you can, Claritin or whatever it is, right, in the grocery store. This is an unintended consequence of making them illegal because, my favorite line in the movie Jurassic Park, when the scientist is warning them for, trying to recreate the dinosaurs, he says, life always finds a way. That's the thing about people. They will find a way to do things that are bad for them.
Yeah, right.
So we just have to think about changing the incentive structure. And I think outright bans are not the way to go.
Got it. Here's a question from one of our participants in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A new study from the Pew Research Center shows that America's Christian majority has been shrinking for years. And if recent trends continued, Christians could make up less than half of the US population within a few decades. The long-term ramifications of this trend on the influence of policy are obvious. To what does IFWE or any of the other groups that you're associated with attribute this trend, and what can we as Christians do to reverse it?
It's such an important question. Thank you for asking that. I think that this is a real problem. Again, what I'm going to say as a response is unsatisfying because there's not like a policy we can use to fix it. This is a much deeper cultural problem, but I will say this, I believe this deeply, that this problem, is exacerbated by the size and scope of the growth in the size and scope of government. So if you look at the past 100 years of US history, government has become a behemoth. It used to be kind of under 10% of government spending to GDP, and now it's like 40, right? So government has grown not just in size, but in scope, meaning what it can, kind of inform or direct. And I think that this is a problem for churches. I think this is this alongside kind of radical secularization, which is kind of taking over the culture. These are real problems. And so for your point in your question that these present obvious problems, right? Obvious problems because Christians are salt and light. Go back to kind of the New Testament command, love our neighbor as ourselves, right? Make disciples of nations. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And so the work of the church becomes hard under a cumbersome government. And so to me, I'm not saying the United States is Marxist, but I will say that it is not an accident that in Marxism, the recommendation for government is state-sponsored atheism. Why? Because the family is an impediment to an authoritarian state. Mm-hmm. So I'm not, again, I'm not trying to overstate what's going on in the United States, but I think that's a path that's very dangerous, which is kind of radical secularization. And so what fixes this? It's a church problem, right? So this is not, you can't kind of engage in a policy unless the government decides overnight to make itself smaller, which would, I think, solve a lot of our problems because it would advance economic freedom, right? So I think about, kind of supporting religious freedom, supporting the church, thinking about these cultural grassroots organizations that need to be very vibrant because they are a buttress against a growing state. So that's a big answer to the problem. But how we go about fixing it, I think we need to be very loud about this and vocal about this in the church. And I think the church needs to take back its arena of society because it too, through welfare programs and lots of things, has been crowded out by the government, right? And that's a problem because if you run to the government instead of running to your church, then that's kind of, again, what Tocqueville saw when he looked at the United States in 1830, is that the Americans, because they were powered by their belief in their faith, they went to this public square to solve problems. They didn't go to the government, right? And he compared that to the French, who was like, he said, anytime they have a problem, they go to government. So I think these things kind of go together in a trend. So I think the church really reclaiming its role in American life is very important here.
So, well, that's one of our questions is a great follow on to what you just said. And the question says that and define institution as the rules of the game or incentives. Are these incentives instituted by man, or are they natural patterns in creation specifically designed by God? And I have a follow-up question to that, possibly. So go ahead.
Okay, great. So I think the work of Doug North is really important here. He was kind of the economist who was recognized for bringing institutions into the discussion of economics. He basically says that there's both, right? So there's formal institutions. These are written down codes of conduct, laws, rules. And so the Constitution of the United States, right? That's a formal document. It's written down. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out what it means, if it's been violated, et cetera, right? Formal, written down. To some extent, man-made, but based on what the founders thought, kind of the productive role of government would be, which I think some of those are timeless, transcendent ideas. But then there's kind of, institutions that we call informal. They're still the rules of the game. In other words, they create incentives for behavior and they govern us, small g. So institutions, the rules govern us. Some formally govern us, like the Constitution. Some informally govern us, like traditions, values, beliefs, right? All those types of things. So people are going to start going out to the store and they're going to buy trees that have been cut down in a field and they're going to put them in their houses and put lights on them, right? What is that about? That is a commercial exchange that's based on a tradition that people have Christmas trees at Christmas time, right? So you only do that once a year. There's no rule that you have to have a Christmas tree, right? But it's an emergent, evolved institution as a way that we celebrate Christmas, right? Things like this. So I think some are formal, design, some emerge and change. And what North said is like, all institutions don't lead to increased productivity. So you actually have to discern what are good institutions and institutional rules and which ones are counterproductive institutions and institutional rules. So one last example, I talked about cronyism. If it's rewarded that you can go to the government and get, your competition pushed down through a trade rule or a subsidy or whatever, that's entrepreneurial. We call that political entrepreneurship, but it's destructive, right? So it's kind of changing the rules of the game towards inefficiency and towards privilege. So not all institutions are productive. Mason, did you want to?
Well, yeah. So that you alluded to what I thought might be part of the follow-up question here, which is, you've pointed out to government growing larger by the objective measure, I believe, of spending. And then, I think there are probably maybe even subjective standards of that, like how rules change in our lives or whatever. And then you brought up the example of economic freedom as it relates to hairdressing or versus regulation. And so how do we, if the government is getting bigger, then how could we ever create incentives that were designed by God for human flourishing? I guess my follow-up question is the government, as the government grows, do those incentives become increasingly instituted by man, as our participant has asked?
Maybe, right, it depends on the government, I suppose, but the big government is always something to be worried about. And again, I say that not as an ideological point, as an economic point and a philosophical theological point, right? So God on the seventh day didn't create government. And so I'm not saying that government is irrelevant, right? But it's not the be all end all to problem solving, right? Because what the government uniquely has is force. That's how economists study government. Sometimes you have to force people to do stuff, like pay their taxes. That's not even always legitimate, right? But if we could just say we could agree on some tax, that we'd be willing all to pay to get the public goods that we need, then you could say, okay, I'm going to pay that. But if I decide 1 year not to pay that, the government, because it has force, can make me pay, right? They can make you do things. They can make you not do things. This is both good. Forget about civil society. What should be left to that? Civil society is church, family, nonprofits, right? Those things exist not, kind of outside of the state and the market. And so I think your question is, just a growing state is necessarily bad because it's going to take over all those other arenas of life. And then it necessarily becomes authoritarian. That's what we want to avoid, right? So I think that's the answer to your question, right? Is that, yeah, but yes, authoritarianism means it's going to be somebody's decision.
Sure.
They're going to impose it on us.
And the participant who originally asked this question has a response here too, which I think is an important one to the current question being asked. The Bible is the key, that God's instructions for man in our current condition are to cultivate flourishing.
That's right.
Here's a little bit of a shift, and I think that given our technological and digital sophistication about metrics, this is a pretty interesting idea here. Economic freedom versus cultural differences of shalom. How do you establish metrics of biblical flourishing versus GAAP metrics so cultural differences reach economic freedom within the cultural differences?
Yeah. This is not easy, of course, because first of all, right? I mean, it's all up to everybody's interpretation of what those biblical metrics would be.
Sure.
And I also think this is why culture is such a robust, rich concept that economists are, we're trying to get better, I think, at measuring these things, but some of them are just almost like unmeasurable, right? Right. It's like, how do you measure what good culture is versus bad culture? This is hard. They're trying. So there's something that Cato puts out, and it's called the Human Freedom Index. I encourage people to look at it. It's an interesting attempt to do some of this. So they measure things like freedom of mobility, freedom of association. So things that, are not just monetary. So in economic freedom, we're measuring the monetary. So we want to measure the non-monetary things, but that matter very much for, whether people can flourish. And so, I would be in support of somebody starting a biblical human freedom index or flourishing index, right? So we try to measure those things. But I think we need to be careful because oftentimes when we're trying to come up with a metric, we want to understand what to do, and then we want to go out and plug it in, right? So we view the world as a model. I'm not saying that this person's implying that, but that tends to be what we want. Even when my students look at economic freedom, they're like, okay, now let's go tell them to do those things. And the problem is you can't tell a country to be free. You can kind of talk about principles. You can talk about what their vulnerabilities are, whether it's regulation or inflation, which we're dealing with today, right, in the US, among other places, but you can't force it. And so I think that would be illustrative for us to understand how we think about flourishing in an empirical way. And then kind of that would also get to what's off the table, right? So there's lots of things that a Christian living in a free market society would opt out of. Drugs would be one of them, right? And so Jim Otteson, who's kind of really thoughtful on these matters, he says that markets empower you with the right to say no, thank you, right? But you have to be driven to do that. So it's like, yeah, I can buy heroin if I wanted to, but I don't, because that's sin. And so that's what my compass is. My compass isn't just, well, it's for sale, so I can buy some. My compass is God doesn't want me doing that because it's not good for me. It doesn't lead to my flourishing or the flourishing of society, right? So I think that's more broadly how we have to think about it. But anyway, I would love to see kind of think about what a metric would be around that. I think it would be very hard to get even the writers of that index to agree on what it would look like. That's the hard part. It's very subjective.
Yeah. But it's an interesting concept, especially as it relates to, our economic freedom and
absolutely.
Yeah.
So my friend Sarah Estelle at Hope College, just really briefly, I'll plug her new work. She's come up with something called the Religious Freedom Index. So every state gets a score. So she is starting to look at some of these things, right? So how free is the church? How free are people to have freedom of conscience? So again, I think there's good efforts to try to measure some of this stuff that are going on out there.
I want to ask one final question here, and for everyone still here, we've put a link to the survey in the chat function, and if you fill the survey out and give us your mailing address, we'll send you this Counting the Cost book, which is a collection of essays, Counting the Cost: Christian Perspectives on Capitalism. I really want to end on this, and I wanted to thank you also, Anne. This has been, once again, just super informative and enlightening. The first essay in this book is from Michael Novak, and he takes on the definition of capitalism, and he changes it from the dictionary definition, which mainly consists of property rights, free markets, and profit. And he gives a different definition. I'll read it quickly because it leads to my question. Novak's definition of capitalism is the invention-based economic system made possible by laws protecting intellectual property, plus habits of economic initiative, enterprise, and practical wisdom, and in which the main cause of wealth is fresh ideas, ventures, and exercised know-how. And I just love that expression, exercised know-how. So in your opinion, in our technological and digitally advanced society, do you see this type of capitalism that Novak is describing as thriving, or is it diminishing?
I guess I could answer that, country by country. I won't do that. But I think that if I look at the broad, kind of global economic freedom has been on the very slow incline. That's a good thing. I think countries have gotten freer in turn, opened up their markets, and in turn, over time, many have become more democratic. So political liberalism was very important to Novak, right? He talked about, the overlapping nature of, free markets, political liberalism, and then he talked about the necessity and all of that with cultural pluralism, right? So we kind of have to have a very dynamic set of ideas, and all those things were important. So I think in the United States, though, what I'm seeing is that some of this is on the decline, and it's not just burdensome regulations. I think those are really big problems because they're inegalitarian. They hurt the poor more than the rich, because the rich are the ones writing the rules, right? They have this kind of privilege that's been extended to them. That's a problem. But I just think culturally, right? When I think about Novak's call for pluralism, and then I think about the way that we talk about people that we disagree with, I think the loss of civility in American politics, just in American cultural life, I think villainizing people who we disagree with is a huge sin, frankly, and it's arrogant. So I think we need to stop doing those things. Living in the digital age is a great thing, but I think Twitter kind of makes some of this worse, right? Because it's like easy for me to be a keyboard warrior and be mean to people and make myself feel better. So this is what I think is most at risk. I think all of these problems are redeemable. They are redeemable. Venezuela can improve its economy, so can we, right? They're very different sets of problems, but they're problems nonetheless. They're redeemable, but they first require the right framework, flourishing, and they second require, policy and legal responses that are in accordance with that flourishing. Who's going to do that? It's got to be Christians, right? Living their faith in their daily lives. We're the ones. We're the ones who do it.
Well, great. Well, thank you. Once again, thank you for your insight, your wisdom, your faith, sharing your stories. And for all of you, thank you for participating in our second webinar. We will email the survey to you as well. If you don't have time to click on the link right now, we really appreciate your feedback so that we can improve these learning programs. And thanks again so much. And to all of you, I wish you the very best holiday season, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.